Have you ever heard of a developing or non-Western nation imposing sanctions on a powerful Western country? Probably not, and that's not just coincidence. The use of sanctions has long been a tactic employed by the West to maintain control and punish dissent. It's a tool they use with confidence, knowing full well that the countries they target often lack the power or unity to respond in kind. African nations, in particular, have repeatedly found themselves on the receiving end of economic and political penalties, not because of any universal wrongdoing, but simply for making sovereign decisions that go against Western interests. Consider recent events in countries like Uganda, Niger, Gabon, and the Central African Republic. These nations were ejected from the U.S.-led African Growth and Opportunity Act, not due to war crimes or terrorism, but simply for policy decisions that the West disapproved of. Uganda passed a law reflecting its cultural values, and in response, the United States imposed travel restrictions on its officials. In Niger, after a military transition, the European Union moved swiftly to place sanctions on the new leadership. This pattern of behavior has become all too predictable. Sanctions are no longer about justice or promoting peace. They're a means of enforcing obedience. And the so-called international community often remains silent, mainly because the institutions that could speak out are heavily influenced or outright dominated by the same Western nations issuing these sanctions. Despite being victims of centuries of exploitation and modern-day interference, African nations have rarely, if ever, retaliated. There has been no significant attempt to impose sanctions on former colonial powers or modern aggressors from the West. Why is it fear, a lack of unity, or perhaps decades of psychological conditioning have made African leaders believe they lack the leverage to fight back? The truth is, Africa is home to 54 nations, more than the combined number of countries in the US, Canada, and Europe. Imagine the statement it would make if even a handful of these countries united to impose reciprocal sanctions on those who continue to treat the continent as a pawn in global politics. So far, Africa has chosen the path of restraint, but history teaches us that silence and patience often go unrewarded, especially when dealing with powers who see compliance as weakness. Every time an African nation tries to chart an independent path, it risks punishment. These sanctions aren't about rule breaking, they're about disobedience, about a refusal to follow the script written in Western capitals and global institutions like the United Nations, particularly its Security Council, further reinforce this imbalance. The 5 permanent members, especially the United States, hold veto power that allows them to shield their own interests while weaponizing the system against weaker nations. This structural bias ensures that African voices remain marginalized and that justice is never truly impartial. Real peace and fair representation can never emerge from a framework that is this one-sided. And so, a bold question now rises: if Western powers can impose economic warfare without consequence, what is stopping Africa from doing the same? We've seen how these sanctions impact lives. Measures like asset freezes, trade embargoes, and aid cuts don't just affect governments, they devastate everyday people. Often, they don't even resolve the problems they claim to address. Instead, they create new crises. One prime example is Eritrea. In 2009, the UN sanctioned the country, alleging it had supported terrorist groups in Somalia and was involved in regional conflict. These measures crippled Eritrea, blocking weapons imports, cutting off aid, and halting military cooperation. In 2011, even harsher sanctions followed, targeting its diaspora income and mining sector. Yet after nearly a decade of hardship and isolation, the global community quietly admitted that there was no credible evidence to support the original claims. The sanctions were lifted in 2018, but by then, irreversible damage had been done. Eritrea had lost 10 years of development, prosperity, and international trust based on unproven allegations. And yet, powerful nations like the US, UK, or France, regardless of their own controversial foreign actions, are never subjected to similar punishments. That's because they're not just players in this system, they're its architects. What's even more disturbing is how Western powers have begun outsourcing sanctions. Instead of directly punishing African nations, They now rely on regional organizations like ECOWAS or the African Union to do the job for them. These institutions, originally created to promote unity and peace, have slowly become tools of foreign enforcement. Libya is a cautionary tale. Sanctions against the Gaddafi government were followed by military intervention and the complete destabilization of the country. Today, we see a similar but more subtle trend repeating itself. Since 2019, regional African organizations have sanctioned multiple countries after political transitions or military takeovers: Mali, Guinea, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Gabon among them. But these actions have done little to restore order. In many cases, they've worsened internal tensions and eroded public trust. ECOWAS, in particular, has become the West's favorite enforcer. Around 70% of recent coups in Africa have been met with its sanctions, yet none have led to successful regime reversals. The African Union, too, has displayed inconsistent behavior, suspending some countries immediately, hesitating with others, and often framing decisions based on Western narratives. In Chad, for instance, a military-led transition was treated as a security concern rather than a violation of democratic norms. The double standards are clear. However, resistance is slowly emerging. Countries like Mali and Burkina Faso have openly challenged ECOWAS sanctions and chosen instead to support neighboring post-coup governments. This quiet rebellion is growing, and with it, the idea that Western pressure no longer guarantees African compliance. It's forcing the continent to ask a difficult but necessary question: have Africa's institutions been compromised? Are they truly representing African interests or simply acting as enforcers for foreign agendas? If these organizations genuinely served Africa's people, foreign interference would have little space to flourish. But time and again, we see African leaders running to the West for validation, money, or security assistance even when such support worsens their problems. The tragedy of Libya serves as a grim reminder of what happens when foreign powers dictate African outcomes. Once a thriving nation, Libya now lies fractured, proof that Western involvement, especially when disguised as humanitarian or diplomatic effort, often leaves behind only chaos. Today, sanctions have become the preferred weapon, not just imposed by the West, but also by African institutions that have fallen under its sway. Leaders who oppose Western influence, no matter how democratic or popular they may be, face economic isolation and political attacks. Meanwhile, those who align with foreign powers, even when guilty of corruption or abuse, are left untouched. The hypocrisy is staggering. This is why more and more voices across Africa are calling for radical change. The time has come for African nations to stand tall, cut the puppet strings, and take ownership of their future. That means reforming or even rebuilding institutions like the O and ECOWAS to genuinely reflect the will of the people, not foreign sponsors. It also means reevaluating how Africa interacts with the world. Instead of relying on outdated alliances or foreign aid, the continent must explore partnerships based on equality and mutual interest with emerging powers like China, Russia, and others in Asia. Some propose even more dramatic actions, issuing sanctions on former colonial powers for historical exploitation, penalizing companies that continue to plunder Africa's natural resources, and banning foreign officials who undermine African sovereignty. This is not just symbolic, it's a declaration that Africa will no longer be a passive player. In its own story, the continent must also industrialize on its own terms, driven by local innovation and leadership that includes shutting down foreign military bases that operate under the guise of security, but often serve as hubs for surveillance, influence, and control. Ironically, the sanctions imposed by the West may be speeding up Africa's awakening instead of tightening their grip. They've pushed nations to search for independence and dignity on their own terms. Have you ever imagined a world where Africa isn't just reacting to global events, but actively shaping them? As the influence of Western powers like Washington and Brussels begins to wane, a new global alignment is emerging, one not built on colonial legacy or dominance, but on diversified, multipolar cooperation. While Western leaders continue to operate with assumptions grounded in outdated power dynamics, the world is quietly shifting. Misjudgments by figures like President Joe Biden, especially his unwavering confidence in Ukraine's war strategy, and his failure to read the rise of African sovereignty movements are now echoing back. As economic instability at home, inflation, supply chain disruptions, and food shortages are just the beginning. For decades, Western policymakers believed Africa would remain firmly within their orbit. But that belief was not just optimistic, it was fundamentally disconnected from reality. What they failed to see is now taking shape, a continental awakening. Africa is no longer willing to be treated as a pawn. It's beginning to assert itself on the global stage. The sanctions imposed by the West, once considered untouchable, are now being questioned. The bigger question is whether Africa might finally start to respond in kind. If sanctions are tools of power, why should they remain a one-way street? Africa's voice is growing stronger, and this resistance may just mark the beginning of a much larger transformation. Recent threats from Washington have the potential to trigger one of the greatest diplomatic missteps in modern times, possibly accelerating the end of America's era of unchecked global dominance. While the West continues to use economic threats and diplomatic pressure, countries like Russia have taken a different approach. For instance, through Turkish mediation, Moscow recently allowed grain exports from Odessa to resume just in time to prevent a looming hunger crisis in parts of Africa and the Middle East. This wasn't just about food, it was about preserving social order. In many nations, affordable bread isn't simply a meal, it's a pillar of stability. Remove it, and society begins to unravel. We've seen it time and again. When markets go empty, unrest follows. Extremist groups capitalize on desperation. Migrants flee in massive waves, often heading straight for Europe. So, while the West postures and threatens, Putin's timely decision supported by Erdogan helped defuse a crisis. Yet instead of recognizing this contribution, Western leaders responded with hostility. In Ghana, for instance, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, issued sharp warnings to African countries even considering buying Russian oil. The message was loud and clear: disobey and face the consequences. But this aggressive stance is backfiring. Many African nations are now slowly stepping away from Western influence. Biden's foreign policy seems to repeat past mistakes, overpromising, under-delivering, and ultimately isolating key global partners. Take his reluctance to enforce Trump-era threats of secondary sanctions against countries like China and India for buying Iranian oil. The reason was simple: doing so would create more problems than it would solve. Now, a similar dilemma faces the White House when African countries begin ignoring Western restrictions. This is especially relevant given Africa's vital role in the modern tech economy. Minerals like cobalt, essential for making lithium-ion batteries, come largely from African soil. If the continent decides to reroute its exports to Eastern markets, the effects on global supply chains could be massive, disrupting everything from electric vehicles to smartphones. Biden's biggest strategic failure, however, may lie in Africa's shifting diplomatic stance. Earlier this year, 20 African countries abstained from condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine during a key UN vote. That wasn't an endorsement of war. It was a signal, one, that Africa is tired of choosing sides in a geopolitical chess match that doesn't serve its interests. The message is simple: Africa wants trade with all, peace with all, and dependence on none. But if Western threats persist, neutrality may soon give way to open alignment with Eastern powers. China is already Africa's top trading partner and investor. In Mali, French troops are leaving while Russian personnel move in many places. Old alliances are being redefined. Several African nations are now applying to join BRICS, embracing a future where global leadership isn't dictated solely by the West. Yet, the U.S. response remains tone-deaf. Its decision to expel Uganda, Niger, Gabon, and the Central African Republic from the African Growth and Opportunity Act (AGOA) is a prime example. The reasoning? Alleged human rights abuses and failure to meet democratic standards. But many Africans see it for what it is: political punishment for asserting independence. Take Uganda, targeted for passing laws rooted in its own cultural values, or Niger and Gabon, excluded after military takeovers, even though similar actions by pro-Western regimes often go unpunished. The selective outrage has not gone unnoticed. Across the continent, there's growing frustration. African leaders are increasingly viewing these actions not as support for democracy, but as tools to enforce ideological conformity. And the result could be a significant diplomatic shift. If current trends continue, African nations may respond with reciprocal measures, economic, political, or even symbolic sanctions of their own. The consequences could reshape the world. A unified African response, say, 50 for countries coordinating economic pushback against the US, Canada, and Europe, would mark a historic reversal in global relations. It would challenge long-standing assumptions about power, influence, and who really holds leverage. But for such a bold step to work, Africa must act strategically. It would need to weigh the economic risks, strengthen alliances with supportive nations, and make smart use of its natural advantages, with China and Russia backing many African development projects. The feasibility of such a strategy is increasing. Africa could impose export controls on key resources like cobalt and rare earth minerals, strike at Western luxury markets by restricting access to diamonds, or implement targeted visa bans on Western officials and CEOs involved in exploitative practices. Beyond trade, Africa holds financial power as well. Pulling assets from Western banks or shifting reserves to alternative financial systems could send shockwaves through the global economy without ever involving military force. On the diplomatic front, African institutions like the O could spearhead a new narrative, one that reframes Western sanctions as outdated relics of colonialism, and rally international sympathy for Africa's sovereignty movement. But all of this raises a deeper question. Is Africa ready to stand united in this fight? For the first time in modern history, the continent has a real chance to speak with one voice, not as 50 for fragmented states, but as a powerful, unified force demanding fairness, respect, and true partnership. And if that happens, if Africa breaks away from its historical dependence and leans into a future led by its own vision, the world will never be the same again. So what role will you play in this transformation? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in reclaiming Africa's power and rewriting its place in the global order, be sure to subscribe. This channel is more than a source of information, it's a movement for change. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the conversation. Together, we can spark a new era of African leadership on the world stage.